William didn't know that Harry and Meghan had already recorded their poison.
Meghan Markle's latest claims were supposed to close a painful chapter, silence her critics, and finally place her version of royal history beyond dispute. Instead, one carefully chosen detail reportedly reopened every unanswered question and gave Tom Bower the opportunity he had been waiting for. The new account arrived with confidence. Meghan did not present it as speculation, confusion, or a memory still clouded by pain. She framed it as a correction, a missing piece finally placed where it belonged. According to her version, a crucial moment inside royal life had unfolded differently from what the public had previously understood. The details seemed deeply personal. It carried emotion, vulnerability, and the suggestion that she had been denied information at a time when she most needed honesty. At first, there was nothing obviously explosive about it. The claim sounded believable enough to create sympathy and restrained enough to avoid an immediate response from the palace. It did not accuse one person directly. It did something more powerful. It allowed the audience to reach its own conclusion about isolation, secrecy, and a young woman being kept outside decisions that affected her life. Within hours, the claim was repeated across headlines and commentary. The emotional meaning traveled faster than the details. Few stopped to compare the new version with Meghan's previous interviews, earlier statements, legal material, or the accounts already connected to those around her. But when those older words were placed beside the new ones, a quiet problem appeared. The timing did not fit. Meghan now seemed to suggest that she learned the information later than previously believed. Yet an earlier account indicated that she had already acted upon it. That raised three dangerous questions. Who told her? When did they tell her? And what did she do immediately afterward? This was not a minor mistake involving a forgotten date. The answer changed the entire emotional structure of the story. If Meghan had known earlier, then she may not have been as completely excluded as the new claims suggested. If she learned later, then earlier descriptions of her actions became harder to explain. Either way, the contradiction touched the central themes of her royal experience, whether she had been informed, protected, ignored, or deliberately isolated. Harry now faced a familiar but painful trap. Publicly supporting Meghan would preserve the image of unity they had built together, but confirming every detail could place him against versions he had already helped tell. Silence offered no safety either, because silence allowed others to wonder whether he knew the timeline did not hold. Inside the palace, aides reportedly noticed the discrepancy almost immediately. Yet they said nothing. A denial could revive emails, private meetings, and confidential conversations the monarchy wanted buried. Tom Bower, however, had no interest in letting the inconsistency disappear. He had reportedly been comparing statements, timelines, and previous testimony, searching for the exact point where Meghan's new story began to break. But before Bower could challenge Meghan's new account, he had to return to the earlier version, the one that had already shaped public opinion, divided the royal family, and placed Harry in a position from which there might be no graceful escape. Long before Meghan's newest claim emerged, another version of the story had already traveled around the world. It portrayed a woman trapped inside an ancient institution, a husband desperate to protect her, and a palace determined to control the truth, but hidden within it was a dangerous weakness. In that original account, Meghan had tried to raise the alarm. She had spoken about her pain, reached toward the institution around her, and discovered that royal machinery moved slowly when reputation was at stake. The palace, as the story suggested, was filled with people who understood protocol but failed to understand desperation. Every door seemed guarded by rank, tradition, and silence. The sequence was emotionally devastating because it appeared so clear. Meghan raised a concern. Officials failed to respond with the urgency she needed. Harry gradually understood how serious the situation had become. Then came the final conclusion. Remaining inside royal life was no longer merely difficult. It was dangerous to their peace, their marriage, and the future they wanted for their family. That version soon became the foundation of everything that followed. Their departure was no longer presented as a disagreement over duty. It became an escape from an institution accused of protecting its image before protecting people. Interviews, documentaries, and public statements repeatedly returned to the same message. The palace had rules for every ceremony, but when Meghan needed help, those rules seemed to become walls. Harry reinforced that belief with anger and painful detail. He described private frustration, institutional resistance, and the sense that no one fully understood what was happening until it was almost too late. Yet beneath his certainty, his wording sometimes carried more caution than Meghan's. He spoke broadly about failure, but became less precise when discussing who had been informed, when conversations occurred, and which officials had authority to act. That hesitation mattered. Former aides allegedly remembered a more complicated chain of events. They did not necessarily deny Meghan's suffering. Instead, they questioned the order in which concerns were raised, options were discussed, and decisions were made. Inside the royal household, nothing moved through one person alone. Requests could pass through private secretaries, legal advisors, senior courtiers, and family members before any final answer emerged. That made the phrase "the palace refused" emotionally powerful, but dangerously simple. Emails, schedules, meeting notes, and witness recollections could show that conversations had happened, assistance had been considered, or alternatives had been offered, even if Meghan felt those efforts were too little or too late. Questioning the story publicly remained almost impossible. Any challenge risked appearing heartless, as though factual doubts were being used to dismiss genuine pain. Bauer understood that danger. His strategy was not to argue that Meghan had felt nothing. It was to examine the structure beneath her account, the dates, messages, meetings, and decisions holding every accusation in place. And when the original account was placed beside Meghan's latest version, the problem became impossible to dismiss, because one story required the palace to know everything, while the other depended on Meghan having told almost no one at all. The contradiction did not explode in a single sentence. It emerged slowly, almost invisibly, through dates, private meetings, forgotten interviews, and one detail Meghan had once described very differently. But once the timeline was reconstructed, the two versions could no longer comfortably exist together. The sequence began before the public knew anything was wrong. Meghan's concerns were still private, confined to conversations with Harry and a small circle inside the royal household. Then came the meetings, the requests for help, and the growing belief that the institution either could not or would not respond. Finally, the pressure reached its breaking point, and the couple began moving toward the decision that would separate them from royal life. But the earlier account and the newest claim described that journey in sharply different ways. In one version, Meghan had directly approached senior officials and made the seriousness of her position clear. In the other, she suggested that she remained largely silent because she believed seeking help was impossible. Both accounts carried emotional force, yet together they created a question that could not be ignored. When did the palace actually know? The newest claim placed one decisive conversation at a different point in the timeline. That shift changed everything. If the discussion happened earlier, then more officials may have known than Meghan later suggested. If it happened later, then her previous description of actions taken before that conversation became difficult to explain. Perhaps the new version had been shaped to answer earlier criticism. Meghan had often been challenged over why she stayed silent, why she did not approach certain people, or why no immediate intervention followed. A revised detail could close one gap. But in closing it, another opened. Bauer began building his case with patience. He compared published interviews, legal material, statements from former staff, and Harry's own descriptions of the same period. He was not searching for one dramatic confession. He was searching for the point where language, timing, and action stopped matching. Then came the recollection of a former palace employee. According to that account, advice, assistance, or a private discussion had been offered before Meghan claimed anyone fully understood the seriousness of her situation. The insider did not deny that Meghan was struggling. The challenge was narrower and more dangerous. The sequence was wrong. That threatened more than Meghan's reputation. It raised the possibility that palace officials had been blamed for knowledge they did not possess, that Harry had acted without the full picture, and that a complex private crisis had later been simplified into a cleaner public story. Harry now stood inside the contradiction. Correcting Meghan could appear disloyal. Remaining silent allowed critics to suggest that he supported a version he could not completely verify. The palace stayed quiet, not from weakness, but calculation. Bauer's challenge carried greater force because it came from outside royal walls. Then the crucial conflict emerged. Meghan's newest claim placed her discovery or disclosure at a moment directly contradicted by an earlier statement describing actions she had taken weeks or even months before. The evidence was now arranged, the dates were aligned, and the contradiction was visible, but Tom Bauer had not yet delivered his most damaging conclusion about what Meghan's changing story could reveal. When Tom Bauer finally addressed Meghan's new claims, he did not offer a cautious disagreement or a polite correction. He dismantled the story piece by piece, arguing that the latest version did not clarify the past, it exposed a contradiction at the heart of Meghan's entire royal narrative. Bauer's accusation was direct. Meghan's newest account could not be placed beside her earlier version without something giving way. Either the first story had been incomplete, the latest one had been reshaped, or both had been presented with details designed to serve different moments. To Bauer, this was not a harmless change in wording. It was a fracture running through the entire sequence. He focused on three questions: when Meghan learned the crucial information, when palace officials were told, and when Harry supposedly understood the seriousness of the situation. In one account, Meghan appeared to have raised concerns openly and waited for help that never came. In another, she seemed too isolated, frightened, or uncertain to reveal the full truth. Each position strengthened her image in a different way. Together, they were far harder to defend. Bauer did not depend only on unnamed insiders. He returned to Meghan's own words. Earlier interviews, public statements, and carefully delivered recollections became the evidence against the latest claim. The more those accounts were compared, the less the contradiction looked like a misunderstanding. It also changed how the palace's conduct could be judged. Officials previously portrayed as knowingly cold may not have possessed the information they were accused of ignoring. That possibility did not erase Meghan's pain, but it shifted responsibility and threatened one of the most powerful foundations of the Sussex narrative. Then came Bauer's harshest conclusion. He suggested the new claim had been designed to strengthen Meghan's present image, even if doing so weakened the reliability of what she had said before. The allegation spread quickly. Commentators replayed old interviews, examined exact phrases, and placed conflicting statements beside one another. No palace denial was required. The inconsistency appeared to speak for itself. Meghan's supporters pushed back. They argued that trauma, pressure, fear, and the passage of time could alter how painful events were remembered. Human memory was not a legal transcript. Bauer rejected that defense. Feelings might be difficult to measure, he argued, but dates, meetings, messages, and the identities of those informed were factual claims. Harry's account offered no clean escape. His published descriptions did not fully settle the sequence, and, in places, appeared to create another gap. Meghan may have expected criticism, but perhaps not the speed with which Bauer connected her latest words to details buried in older statements. The result was devastating. The new claim had not silenced her critics. It had handed them the clearest contradiction yet. Yet exposing the contradiction was only the beginning. Because Bauer's next move was even more dangerous, he began asking whether the story had merely changed over time, or whether it had been deliberately rebuilt for a new public purpose. Bauer's most serious allegation went beyond faulty memory. He suggested that Meghan's story had evolved whenever a previous version became vulnerable, with new details appearing to protect her image, answer criticism, and preserve the idea that every royal conflict had only one clear victim. To Bauer, the timing of Meghan's latest claim was as important as the claim itself. It did not emerge when the disputed events were first being examined. It appeared later, at a moment when public interest in the Sussexes was beginning to change and older questions were returning with greater force. That made the revelation feel less like an unplanned confession and more like a carefully positioned response. The new account seemed to answer a criticism that had followed Meghan for years. If the situation was as serious as she described, who had she told, and what had been done? Her latest version offered an explanation. Yet in solving that problem, it collided with an earlier defense. One account required her to have spoken openly. The other depended on her being unable to speak at all. Bauer claimed this reflected a recognizable pattern. First came an emotional revelation powerful enough to command sympathy. Then inconsistencies surfaced. Finally, a new explanation arrived, adding context that protected the central image while quietly changing the details around it. That, he argued, was the difference between correcting a misunderstanding and rewriting history. A correction makes an old sequence clearer. A rewrite changes who knew, who acted, and who carried the blame. There was another possibility. Meghan's advisors may have believed that complicated palace procedures were too difficult to explain publicly. Royal decisions passed through layers of officials, private secretaries, lawyers, and family members. A simplified account could make the emotional truth easier to understand. But simplification came at a price. People became villains. Silence became refusal. Delay became deliberate cruelty. And then there was Harry. Had he known this newest version before it appeared, or had he discovered the altered details only after the controversy began? His instinct was to protect Meghan. Yet another public confrontation threatened to destroy what remained of his relationships with King Charles III and Prince William. Defending her completely could deepen the family divide. Hesitating could wound the marriage he had sacrificed so much to protect. Bauer pressed the most uncomfortable question. If emails, messages, or records could explain the contradiction, why had they not been released? Meghan's defenders answered that private evidence might involve medical confidentiality, intimate conversations, or information she had every right to protect. But Bauer refused to accept privacy as a shield for every inconsistency. Public accusations, he argued, created public consequences. Former aides had been blamed, doubted, and condemned, while confidentiality prevented them from defending themselves. Now the pressure moved toward the one person who may have heard the original version before public relations, interviews, and years of bitterness changed its shape. As attention turned toward Harry, the contradiction stopped being only a battle between Meghan and Bauer. It became a test of marriage, loyalty, and whether the prince would defend the newest story at the risk of exposing his own. For years, Harry had presented himself as Meghan's protector, standing between his wife and the institution he believed had failed them both. But Bauer's challenge created a brutal new dilemma: defend Meghan without qualification, or admit that the story was more complicated than the public had been told. Harry had never been a distant observer in Meghan's account. He was the emotional witness who gave her experience royal authority. When she described isolation, he spoke of institutional failure. When she recalled fear, he confirmed the pressure surrounding them. His voice transformed a private struggle into an accusation the monarchy could not easily dismiss. That was why his silence now felt so loud. After Bauer exposed the contradiction, each day without a response invited another question. Did Harry fully support Meghan's newest version, or had the altered timeline surprised him too? His earlier statements appeared close to hers, but not identical. Small differences remained over when he discovered the seriousness of the problem, whom he confronted, and what action followed. Those differences may not have begun as deception. Harry and Meghan could have experienced the same crisis through separate emotional realities. Meghan remembered abandonment, the feeling that no one was listening when she needed protection. Harry remembered procedure, the conversations, requests, delays, and resistance that made him believe the system would never change. Over time, those memories may have been joined into one powerful public narrative. But under Bauer's scrutiny, the seams were beginning to show. Advisors reportedly understood the danger. They may have urged Harry to remain silent, warning that even a careful clarification could restart the entire controversy, produce new headlines, and trigger demands for emails or private records. Yet silence went against Harry's instincts. He had confronted critics before, especially those he believed had targeted Meghan unfairly. Bauer's claims were not merely professional criticism to him. They touched the marriage Harry had defended against his own family. Inside royal circles, King Charles III and Prince William were unlikely to view the situation as a victory. To them, it may have confirmed something more painful. Every attempt to retell private disputes created new contradictions, deeper resentment, and fewer paths toward reconciliation. Harry feared that admitting any inconsistency would be treated as betrayal. Meghan could see caution as hesitation when she expected complete support. Their supporters could see it as surrender to the palace, yet defending every detail might force Harry to confirm a sequence his own account did not fully support. That was the tragedy. He had walked away from royal life partly to protect his marriage, but the story of that escape was now creating pressure within the very relationship he had tried to save. A carefully worded response began to seem like his only option, one that affirmed Meghan's pain without confirming the disputed timeline. But such a compromise might satisfy no one. But while Harry struggled to find words that would not deepen the crisis, the palace faced a different calculation: whether continued silence still protected the monarchy, or whether Bauer's revelations had finally made silence more dangerous than disclosure. Behind palace walls, the truth was not remembered only through emotion. It existed in diaries, security records, staff notes, appointment schedules, emails, and carefully preserved correspondence. And if even one document contradicted Meghan's latest account, the entire dispute could move beyond opinion into something far more damaging. Senior royal life produced a record of almost everything. Meetings were scheduled, security movements were logged, travel plans were approved, changed, or cancelled. Requests involving health, legal concerns, staffing, and official duties passed through several hands. Even when a deeply personal crisis remained hidden from the public, it could still leave traces throughout the machinery of the monarchy. A cancelled engagement might reveal that officials knew something was wrong. An altered journey could prove that private discussions had already begun. A sudden instruction to staff, an emergency call, or a meeting added to a diary could challenge the idea that no one understood the seriousness of Meghan's position. That possibility may have explained Bauer's confidence. He did not need to reveal every source publicly to suggest that documents and witnesses existed. His certainty implied that the palace's silence should not be mistaken for an absence of evidence. But releasing that evidence carried its own danger. Private records could expose medical details, revive family trauma, and make the monarchy appear to be fighting a personal war against Meghan. For King Charles III, the choice was agonizing. Defending former aides and the institution might protect the official record, but it could push Harry even further away. Prince William's position was reportedly less forgiving. To him, repeated public claims may already have crossed boundaries once considered sacred. Yet even William understood that palace retaliation could create sympathy for Meghan and turn disputed memories into another global confrontation. Inside the household, the disagreement sharpened. One group believed silence remained the safest defense. Another feared that silence would allow Meghan's account to harden into accepted history. Former aides felt especially trapped. Their actions had been questioned publicly, but duty and confidentiality prevented them from answering with equal force. Then rumors began to center on one possible piece of evidence: a previously unknown meeting, written request, or offer of assistance made before Meghan said the palace understood her distress. If confirmed, it could break the latest timeline apart. Meghan's defenders would argue that paperwork could never capture the fear, loneliness, or emotional pressure she experienced. Bauer's answer was colder. Emotional truth, he insisted, could not excuse factual contradictions when real people were accused of refusing help they may have offered. And now, one former aide was reportedly considering speaking without palace approval. If that testimony emerged, the contradiction would no longer belong to Bauer alone, but even without it, the damage had already begun spreading beyond one disputed story and into the future of Harry and Meghan's public identity. By the time the controversy reached its peak, the argument was no longer simply about one claim. It had become a referendum on Meghan's credibility, Harry's loyalty, Bauer's motives, and the palace's silence, for competing forces fighting to control how royal history would ultimately remember the Sussex departure. The public split almost immediately. To Meghan's critics, the contradiction looked like another moment in which a carefully built story had begun collapsing under the weight of its own revisions. To her supporters, Bauer's attack appeared to be part of a familiar pattern. Another attempt to punish a woman who had challenged the traditions, power, and secrecy of the monarchy. But contradictions carried a danger that ordinary accusations did not. An accusation could be denied. A contradiction invited people to go back. Old interviews were replayed. Earlier statements were examined with new suspicion. Details once accepted as emotional truth were suddenly treated as evidence. Meghan did not need to answer every challenge directly. A public battle with Bauer could give his claims greater reach and create demands for documents, messages, and witnesses. Instead, she could respond through controlled appearances, supportive interviews, and projects centered on family, confidence, and independence. The message would be clear. Without naming him, she had moved forward. Harry had fewer choices. He could defend every detail and risk tying himself to a timeline he could not fully prove. He could admit confusion and weaken their united front. He could remain silent and allow doubt to spread. Or he could attack Bauer's motives, shifting attention from the contradiction to the man exposing it. The palace remained publicly distant. Privately, however, officials understood that every inconsistency reduced the need for an official defense. Bauer was creating doubt without forcing the monarchy to enter the fight. The cost was reconciliation. Charles might still long for contact with his son, but trust could not grow while private events were repeatedly reshaped for public consumption. William's fear ran deeper. Any renewed relationship, he may have believed, could become material for another interview, another memoir, or another conflicting version of the past. Bauer's victory was not proving that every palace account was true. It was making certainty impossible. Meghan's emotional suffering may have been genuine, even if dates and sequences were simplified over time. Yet history depends on more than emotion. Every new version made the original truth harder to recover. Every contradiction gave both sides another weapon, and the most dangerous question remained unanswered. Would the next revelation finally clear Meghan, or expose a larger inconsistency involving Harry himself? Because in the war over royal truth, no story remains private forever. And somewhere between Meghan's newest claim, Harry's silence, Bower's evidence, and the palace's locked records, another version may already be waiting to emerge.